clearly it was a bad moment to call the election. I was open in saying that to the Prime Minister when he called it. It was too late because he'd already been to see the King. But I never really saw the logic of going into an election 21 points behind in the polls, unless you had a really kind of incredible campaign sorted out where you've surprised everybody but not yourselves.
Yeah.
I didn't see how it could make much progress in the event. I think the people who were most surprised were us.
And how did you think the campaign itself went?
It was brilliant. It was a first-class example of
exactly how you would have done it.
Exactly.
I'm Ben Houchen. This is the Blueprint Podcast, brought to you by Conservative Home, and we're going to lift the lid on centre-right politics in the UK. We're going to be speaking with influential figures from across the political spectrum to help understand how we can make centre-right politics relevant to people's lives again and turn it back into a political force for good. This week's guest is Grant Shapps, the former Conservative MP for Welwyn Hatfield from 2005 to 2024. I am going to have to read this out from our guest because he has had a long and illustrious career in the Conservative Party and in government. Started out as a Minister of State in Housing and Local Government, Chairman of the Conservative Party, Minister of State for International Development, Secretary of State for Transport, Secretary of State for Business, Secretary of State for Energy Security and Net Zero, and then latterly Secretary of State for Defence. I mean, supported David Cameron, Boris Johnson, latterly Rishi Sunak. Great campaigner, strong communicator, and a pragmatic, competent minister who I know has been trusted by multiple leaders. Grant Shapps, thank you for joining me on the Blueprint Podcast.
Thank you very much. only part way through. It's amazing, isn't it?
It's basically half the recording of the whole of the podcast.
I think actually I was also a Cabinet Office Minister and also a Foreign Office Minister during that time as well.
Well, I had to be slightly selective.
Actually, look back, I've done that.
Well, one of the things that is particularly personal to me, you won't remember this, Grant, but when you were party chairman back in 2012, you might remember a bit of this, but I stood in the Middlesbrough by-election in 2012 after Sir Stuart Bell died, and you were the chairman. And it was after that process I actually applied to the candidates list, and it was you as chairman that allowed me to go on the candidates list.
I do. I remember it well, actually, and I think, who is this guy? This is really impressive.
A few phone calls kind of saying, do we really want this guy on there?
No, I think we made a good call, actually, Ben. And as I was just joking with you as I came in, I read now you are, well, not joking, it's true, the most senior elected Conservative in the whole of the United Kingdom. So, I wasn't wrong about my judgment there.
Well, yeah, also slightly worrying. And I think one of the reasons that I started this podcast is ultimately there is a crisis in the centre-right of politics in the UK. And, we've got to look forwards and figure out how we rebuild. And what does it mean to be a Conservative? I mean, I've been speaking to leadership contenders, and I'm sure you've been listening to on the podcast. And the question that comes up in every single one of those conversations is, what is it to be a Conservative? What do Conservatives stand for in the UK?
So I think the great thing about being Conservative just generally is if you are from another party, either you're rarely going to see government, Liberal Democrats, be a fringe party and find it difficult, not least because of first past the post, but in the end just by not having enough support, or you're the Labour Party who have to move on to basically our territory in order to win. Keir Starmer, before him Tony Blair. Actually, if you're Conservatives, the answer to what is a Conservative, it is where the mainstream of this country is and where we should be. In other words, centre-right without being extreme, sensible, pragmatic, efficient with spending other people's money, in other words, the taxpayers' cash, and believing in our country and believing that our best days are ahead. Now, those, I think, all of those, along with hard work, entrepreneurship, are Conservative values. It's where this party is when we are ourselves and at our best. And it's where, for other parties, they have to, in the case of Labour, pretend to move in order to get themselves elected. And then, as we've seen afterwards, quickly show the real colours, massive pay rises to the union friends and all the rest of it. So actually, at our best, we are just ourselves. And that is what we've got to get back to.
Do you think, is there an element, though, of the other way? So if you look back at David Cameron in the run up to 2010, I think as well with Boris Johnson, I mean, if you go back to David Cameron, he did the whole hug a hoodie thing. And the idea, principle being that the Labour Party, if they want to win, you're absolutely right, tend to need to move towards us, particularly on economic grounds, to show that, you know, they're not going to completely screw up the country again. But the converse tends to be, well, does the Conservatives on social values rather than economic ones tend to move slightly more towards the centre?
So,
I mean, David Cameron did that, but Boris did that in particular.
Look, you winning a majority is about building a coalition of, you know, a broad enough spread of people that you're going to actually be able to create that majority. So, yeah, of course, you've got to appeal across the, you know, across the aisle, as they say in America, you know, across the political spectrum, as we say here, of course. But we have the built-in advantage as Conservatives. It's where the population is. It's what we fundamentally believe in as Brits. If you work hard, if you try to get on in life, if you try to do the right thing by you and your family, you should be able to progress. And you should do that with minimum interference from the state. It should be there when you need it, but not always in your face. These are basic Conservative principles. And I'm not against coalition building. And I don't think that you... but I don't think you need to do it by pretending to be Social Democrats, for example. Just in the same way as I don't think you need to do it by pretending to be, you know, drier than dry on fiscal policy either. You just end up making a mess of it when you try and do those things. We just have to be true to ourselves. And actually, as I say, built an advantage. We are where the country is. We've just got to stop ourselves from, you know, as I said in my concession speech in Hatfield on the night of the election, if people said to me on door after door, if you guys cannot agree with each other, then we can't agree to vote for you. And we have to get those differences ironed out, work out the policy, have the leadership required, bam, present it to people in a cohesive way.
I mean, you know, you've been around a lot longer than I have, Grant, that, you know, one of the rules of politics is nobody votes for a divided party. And I mean, that wasn't just in the last 6 or 12 months. That had been going on for a number of years in the run up to the 2024 election. I mean, one of the interesting things for me as well is you have been around for such a long time, particularly within government and the Conservative Party, you know, as a senior politician. And one of the things I've always noticed about you is that you are, in effect, the consummate professional. I mean, people always say extremely competent minister, will ride out collective responsibility, understands the role, does the job extremely well. You were always seen as a safe pair of hands. But I've always thought slightly, has that then stopped people understanding what your actual, we talk about Conservative values, but what are you as a Conservative?
Yeah.
Because, you know, you're not necessarily on the right wing of the party. You know, I don't think anybody would necessarily consider you kind of like an overly centrist or leftist of the party, because you've always played that role. Like, what are your politics?
Well, look, I mean, first of all, if you go into politics and you're serious about helping to govern the country, then you must accept a degree of collective responsibility, which means that at times, you know, I have found it quite frustrating that I couldn't say, I think this is a daft thing to be doing.
Well, that's grown-up politics, right?
You know, right. Grown-up politics means you come to a decision, you do it in private, and then you present it collectively, and that's how a cabinet operates. I mean, constitutionally, it's how we operate. But that's not to say that, you know, I'm a human being, so I have at times found decisions pretty frustrating. But in general, I still believe that it's better to have Conservatives run this country than it is to have Labour. See, that's where you need to make your decisions, and the party needs to be mature enough to do that. But yeah, it's not. So first of all, where do I stand? So I am a Conservative through and through. I believe in being able to get on with your life, being able to build things, being entrepreneurial. I started my own printing company 33 years, coming up to 34 years this year ago. It still amazingly runs today, probably a lot better because I haven't been running it for the vast majority of its existence now, because I've been in politics so long. And the sort of basic idea that the country should be able to support you, and you should be able to get on because of the opportunities we bring, which actually in this country are phenomenal. You know, every single person in this country has the opportunity of getting healthcare. Like, I've never personally had private healthcare, not because I have anything against it at all. I think good luck to you if you want to have your private health insurance, fine. I just use the NHS. What an amazing levelling factor having an NHS is. Everyone has the right to access education, of which mine wasn't particularly shining. But I went to a grammar school. I got a decent enough education. Didn't particularly like school. Didn't go on to A-levels or I'm pretty sure I was probably the only person in the cabinet most of the time without a degree. But most people wouldn't know that
No,
about
they
me.
wouldn't
They'd
know.
probably
I didn't know
imagine
that.
I went to Oxbridge or something. Nothing could be
Stereotype.
further. Yeah, nothing could be further from the truth. I went to state school and then didn't do A-levels. But that's the brilliant thing about the Conservative Party. It literally never, ever mattered as long as I could get on and do the job. And in terms of doing these jobs, and I did a lot of them as you described, and a lot at cabinet level, I always thought that the most important thing is just to be damn competent in what you do. Just make sure you understand the brief, that you've worked out what the 3 or 4 most important things are, that you handle crises that are bound to come along. I mean, they come along in every single department, but if you handle them poorly, then you're toast, and the country suffers. So I always tried to make sure my number one principle was, work out what you want to do and don't mess up on the basics.
Yeah. Do you find? I mean, I'm going to try and figure out where on the spectrum you're going.
Yeah. Okay. Sure,
so, do you feel? Would you feel, or did you feel more comfortable in a David Cameron Conservative Party or a Boris Johnson Conservative Party?
It depends on what for. So Cameron, I thought, was a consummate political leader in terms of bringing us back from opposition, which is the task that the next leader of the party will have in front of him or her. Given that we'd not been in power, he had to sort of create a prime minister in waiting without anyone having seen any evidence of him having actually ever run anything whatsoever. So he had a set of skills to do that, Cameron. Great presence.
Still to this day as well. I mean, in his short stint back as Foreign Secretary, that was one thing that people really noticed.
To this day, that's right. Because you come back into a job like that and you've been Prime Minister.
Yeah.
You walk into a room, everyone knows you're serious. Yeah. But Boris, actually, so he's quite a difficult question. A seemingly simple question is actually harder than it sounds.
Yeah.
Boris will get the extra 10% out of you. Come on, guys. Come on. What are we waiting for? Come on. Don't you think we can do this? And it was amazing to see how cabinet colleagues and ministers would respond when he was at his best to that extra twisting of the arm done rather beautifully. He would make things happen that probably would have been impossible for, say, Cameron to achieve through pure force of nature, or even something above a force of nature. He'd get more out of you as minister. Now, of course, we all know the downsides of both these gentlemen. Cameron, called a referendum that he didn't win. It's always a bad idea to call an election you can't win. Rishi has found the same thing with the general election. Boris, is not always the most organised of blokes, and that disorganisation in the end was his downfall. I mean, anyone who still thinks that Boris was actually out there, calling, rave parties in Number 10 is entirely wrong about the history of what happened. His problem was that he was not in charge of the administrative nature of Number 10 enough to stop other people from doing it or to notice or whatever. And that was the problem with him. He allowed that lack of organisation to get the better of him. So everyone has their strengths and weaknesses. And so this is not just a former politician's way of fudging your question. The answer, truthfully, is they both had massive pluses and some minuses.
And to be fair, I mean, they're not necessarily on either end of the spectrum, so it probably wasn't the best example. But if we went to both very, very interesting people, both had a huge amount to the Conservative Party. If we went a little bit further and said, would you feel more comfortable sat in the tea room having an intellectual conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg, or would you be at the other end of the table maybe with Nicky Morgan, who approaches things in a different way?
Well, look,
or do you a blend of all of those things?
Great choices, because both of them were colleagues, were colleagues. Like them both. I don't have to agree with you to like you, right? Absolutely. So this is a false question. I can be perfectly friendly.
But it's also not about like. It's they come at politics from very different angles.
Yeah, well,
both exist within the Conservative.
Well, I wouldn't, to take your two examples, I wouldn't choose either Jacob Rees-Mogg's or Nicky Morgan's politics. Actually, is to the precise nth degree of that you describe. Because I'm a Conservative and I'm a Grant Shapps Conservative. So what do I believe? I believe in a party that is absolutely aligned with this country's goals. Plus, and I think this is the bit that's always been missing for many years, has enough ambition for the country that the party and the leader helps to lead the country into a country that's better than the sum of its parts.
Yep.
And I think that bit actually is the bit that has frustrated me. You asked about your kick-off question. What do I really think? What's frustrating? Sometimes, and with all of the leaders that have served, I've been frustrated that they haven't enunciated a vision of Britain which is better than we are today. Too much of it is managerial in nature, dealing with the nooks and crannies, the problems, the crises, sometimes by necessity on a big thing like COVID. But actually, I think a government lets down this country if it's not doing more of what a South Korea or a Singapore or a Taiwan might do, which is to go, actually, what could we be? If we really want to put our heads together, what could we don't have to bumble along.
Yep.
And I think a proper Conservative government would set out a real plan to transform this country. And it ain't going to happen under Starmer and Labour, for sure. But it should happen under Conservatives, but it hasn't happened under Conservatives in recent times, and that's a shame.
I mean, I think that, and we can get into the reasons why this didn't happen, but I think Boris was that person. I've always said Boris was a leader, and people can have an argument over his managerial skills, but in Number 10, the core purpose of Number 10 is to set that culture and set that direction and have that leadership. Yeah. Because again, good cabinet around you with the departments should then help deliver that mission. The thing that frustrated me most about the last 5 years is, Boris was really stopped before all of the nonsense that we've heard about before that, with with COVID actually happening. I mean, it was just a few months after the 2019 election.
Yeah.
Biggest thing that really mattered to me was things like levelling up, and we did bits and pieces, but it really felt like we lost that impetus, that 2 years.
Yeah, no,
the £500 billion that we spent, etc. So I think we've had it in. We have had it, but we haven't been able to utilise it in the way.
I think that's exactly it. And COVID arriving was just a tragedy in every possible way, and it also killed that potential for a sort of Sunny Uplands sort of prime ministerial steer from kind of the ultimate Sunny Uplands person was Boris, the country could have been very different, but who knows? Actually, I mean,
It's easy in hindsight, isn't it? And we don't know which direction it would have gone in. I mean, I suppose moving on, we've just had the election. Sadly, Grant, you're no longer in Parliament. I don't know whether that's a good or a bad thing for you. You've had a few months out now to probably reflect. I thought, let's get Grant on. Like I said, great communicator, but maybe he will speak quite frankly about what your reflections were on the calling of the election campaign itself. What were your views at the time?
But I don't mind speaking completely frankly about it to you, Ben, and your many listeners, because I'm not there, so it doesn't. There's no reason to do otherwise. And I, first of all, just to answer your first question, I did wonder what it would be like. I've been an MP for 19 years. I've served as a minister for most of the 14 years, and for most of that time as a cabinet minister, and increasingly in more and more high-ranking roles. And so the first thing is, I did wonder if I would feel completely kind of discombobulated or something. And actually, I'm pleased to report, actually, I've really enjoyed life after, I guess, the initial weekend of adjustment. But I wasn't a fool. I could see that the election wasn't going well, and it was quite a possible, if not likely, outcome. And of course, there are many pleasures out there, which are things which are difficult to do when you're in a cabinet position like Defence Secretary. Not least, all the time, not just when I was on defence business, but all the time. You have protection 24 hours a day or available to you all the time, and you can't leave the house without them with you. So a romantic walk on a Sunday with my wife would be with me, my wife, 5 usually blokes, 3 armoured cars, and you just want to jump
depends
on a
on
train
your
and
definition
go
of a romantic walk,
romance. Yeah, you want to jump on a train somewhere and what have you. It was a major operation, and actually without plenty of notice impossible.
Yeah.
So just being able to pop out for a pint, grab a pint of milk, those things have been. I still feel slightly naughty, sort of getting on a train and coming to London or whatever. There's no one over
You're
my
expecting
shoulder.
somebody to say, what are you doing? You didn't tell anybody.
So actually, there's a high degree of freedom. The second thing is, like, we've just in terms of family pressures and things, exactly a year ago, I was called back from, my then 3-day-old holiday with my wife, one of the few we've been able to take in the time that I've been in ministerial office, to come back and become Defence Secretary. So in other words, you never knew what was going to happen next. And so there's just that freedom of being able to live your own life again. And I've quickly found things that I'm, really super interested in doing. A couple of startups.
Excellent.
One in AI, which I'm really interested in, and plenty for me to do. So, like, really sort of mentally very happy in myself. I also feel I'm not so completely done with far from done with politics. I actually think there's a greater calling to public service, and it's not because of the money or anything else, because it's also financially beneficial being outside of Parliament rather than inside, but because I think there's a service to the country that actually runs deeper than money or anything else. And then in terms of, clearly it was a bad moment to call the election. I was open in saying that to the Prime Minister when he called it. It was too late because he'd already been to see the King. But I never really saw the logic of going into an election 21 points behind in the polls, unless you had a really kind of incredible campaign sorted out where you've surprised everybody but not yourselves.
Yeah.
I didn't see how it could make much progress in the event. I think the people who were most surprised were us.
And how did you think the campaign itself went?
It was brilliant. It was a first-class example of
exactly how you would have done it.
Exactly. No, look, I mean, I've been party chairman, and I know the complexities of running a campaign, and there are lots of things that happen that just, out of your control, or every campaign has its good and bad days. So first of all, let's not pretend there's some sort of golden campaign. Even 2015, where we unexpectedly won the elections, it was after the coalition, no one saw it coming. On the day of the election, there was a cabinet call with a few of us, and the Prime Minister, then David Cameron, ran through the options of what would happen overnight at the election counts, and we considered every possible option: Labour majority, another coalition with Labour and Lib Dems. The one that we didn't consider was actually that we might win outright. Although I had the data that suggested we win outright, and as did, I think, Linton Crosby at the time, through separate calculations, but no one quite dare believe it. But anyway, even that campaign wasn't without plenty of problems and concerns. So what I'm saying is, the campaign's always tricky. However, there can be no doubt, of course, that it's hard to remember a campaign that was more problematic than this one, right from the timing of its launch, the actual launch in the rain, obviously the D-Day.
What do you think caused it? I mean, we've heard, or I've heard kind of the official lines. I've not sat down with Rishi and kind of had a conversation with him about it, but everybody I spoke to, candidates, members, friends and family who were not interested in politics. Nobody really got the logic of the timing.
And the problem the problem with it was it wasn't just sort of political insiders and geeks who thought the timing was odd. I was literally knocking on doors of random voters to go, just tell me one thing. I just really don't understand why we've got an election right now. I mean, there were 7 months until we had to call one. Right? So we could be sitting here right now and not have had an election. And when you get to the point where the public doesn't understand why you've done it, there's clearly a problem. And the best explanation I could provide, but in the end, Rishi will, no doubt, one day of reveal his mind on it. But I think he would say, look, he thought there were lots of risks over the summer. That it's quite possible that things could get worse rather than better for the then government, and it was better to therefore sort of lance the boil and what have you, as quite a few colleagues said in the pre-meeting room. Bold move, fortune favours the brave. And I said, I think that I would not have done that, Prime Minister. I do not think that was a good idea.
Well, the thing is, people say in hindsight, look at what's happened. The economy's got better. Actually, all of the things that Rishi wanted to happen, lower interest rates,
Unemployment's gone down. Inflation is down.
We are
from
starting
what
to
we
turn
called
that
it.
corner.
Yeah.
The one question, even before the election was called, everybody kind of thought we're going to go long. The accepted wisdom was an October, November election. There were even people genuinely thinking he might actually go longer and push it into the January, which was a possibility. Because I think a lot of people instinctively did feel like there was going to be that shift, with the only question mark, and it was always the question mark, which is, well, has he gone early because of immigration? The small boats thing that was going to come together with immigration figures. Did he think a summer of small boats and more people coming across the channel?
I think that's right. Look, it's always easier when you've got some hindsight on it. But again, to be clear, I said on the day, I think this is a mistake. I actually thought that you could go till, I think, the 25th of January was the last possibility.
I think so.
I actually always thought the 12th of December this year would have been the right date. It would have been 5 years exactly since the last election to the nearest Thursday. And we, I think, could have said we're doing this because we want to give the economy the opportunity to recover because of this. And, as you say, we've now got the fastest growth in the G7 on the first quarter, decent growth on the second quarter, lower unemployment, interest rates have come down, and inflation is still lower than it was when the election was called. So far, not much not to like. On the boats issue, I think securing your borders is one of the most important basic things that a country has to do. I think the two first jobs of a government are secure the country, secure the borders, and then internal security. So really sort of defence and
strong policing,
and then Home Secretary, which I briefly did as well, very briefly. And I think those are two most important jobs of any government. And the problem is, though, if you put dealing with that front and centre of your entire being, then you'll be judged on it. And one of the, I think, really interesting lessons, actually, of the 5 pledges, which were, of course, to reduce inflation, grow the economy, cut debt in the medium term, cut the NHS waiting lists, and stop the boats.
Well remembered. But this is why you were a long-serving government minister, because I couldn't have told you what the 5 were.
But if you think about them all, they're all things you'd expect your government to do before you get up in the morning. None of them are about the sunny uplands that I was talking about before, that I think this is not in reference to Rishi as Prime Minister, but all of our Prime Ministers have failed to set out why we can make this country better for the future and for our children and the children's children. But if you think about those things and you put small boats as one of them, you will be judged on the things that you say are the things to judge me on. If I say, judge me on this, that's the thing. Absolutely. And Starmer's setting out his own, those are the things you'll judge me. If you say, no, don't judge me on this, judge me on this thing, people will go and judge you on that other thing instead. And so, in a sense, by picking that, it'll always be a massive issue, quite rightly so, and we need to sort it. Right, the country needs to sort it. It's ridiculous not to be able to look after your own borders. Many countries suffering the same problem, the States, lots of European countries. But if you then say this is the thing to measure me by, people will measure you by it. And so I think that rather than putting stop the boats out there as one of your, you want to say you will deal with that, but actually we've got there's a whole bunch of other things that we actually also need to sort out as a country. And Starmer will be absolutely terrible on the small boats. He hasn't got the first. His plan is to do things that. Do you not think we might have thought of more law enforcement?
Yeah, the new, border control team or whatever it was.
Do you think that hasn't been tried all along? Do you think we haven't been out arresting people?
Working with our European partners.
Do you think we haven't tried to do those things? Of course, we've done all of those things. He has no chance of solving this. But he also hasn't set himself up by saying, this is judge me by whether I do this one thing. And as a consequence this summer, although no doubt the numbers have been very high since they took office, I'm not yet seeing the headlines about it. And there's the interesting lesson that you, in government in particular, to an extent, you get to make the weather in as much as you can say, judge me by these criteria, and then you live or die by that. And so don't set the wrong weather measurements, right? Yeah. And that is, I think, one of the big lessons out of this, that setting the wrong measurements gets you into difficulty. By the way, it will now happen in a bunch of different ways for Keir Starmer.
But even that, you could make the argument that had he gone long, then actually immigration overall, legal and illegal migration, has come down.
Yes.
He could have framed,
Yes.
judge me on this. Actually, we saw with the amendment to the visa regime, we've seen legal migration drop significantly. So even there was a way in being able to communicate that as a move in the right direction.
Also, and I can't absolve myself from responsibility from this because I did plenty of broadcasts, but what really frustrates me when we come to talk about migration, immigration, is that legal and illegal get conflated all the time.
They do.
And when it comes to legal migration, the numbers which were so sky high, 750,000 or whatever, included all of those Ukrainians and all of those British nationals from Hong Kong that, literally the front pages and the leaders' columns and the public sentiment was, please, can we help these people to whom we have an affinity or responsibility. I mean, I had 3 Ukrainians live in my house.
Well, we saw this in communities where we had Ukrainians and we had people from Hong Kong coming across.
Yeah.
They were welcomed.
Absolutely.
They were supported.
But then why did we not absolutely, from the top, go out of our way to say, yeah, of course these numbers are, because we've got you, first of all, take 300,000 off this because these are the people that we all said that we wanted in the country. Right, now let's talk about it. But we failed to do that. We failed to talk about migration for people coming here to study, which essentially becomes an export.
Yeah, absolutely.
I know it's people coming.
Huge amount of soft power on behalf of the UK institutions
Massive.
as well. Actually.
So I would go around the world to all of these different countries, both in trade, when I was doing some trade in the Cabinet Office whilst I was party chairman, but then latterly as Defence Secretary. And the number of people who are educated here, I mean, just unexpected, like the Saudi energy minister who
is it royals from across the world, leaders of countries, invariably in some form or another have studied at a red brick UK university
and become Anglophiles in ways that most
as a
people
result of that.
So the Saudi energy minister is a great Only Fools and Horses fan.
Really?
Abdulaziz. And he absolutely, and so I'll just flick him over a sort of Del Boy quote or something, and he absolutely loves it. And that is soft power, isn't it?
It is.
The people around the world.
But why is it? I mean, again, you've been around the table for so many years. Why is it that we never separated out student visas from general immigration? What was the argument for it?
It is absolutely crazy. I genuinely, having been a Home Secretary, so I call it my week of work experience as Home Secretary. In fact, the permanent, so he's still there, so I'm slightly betraying a confidence here, but I'm sure he won't mind. The permanent secretary at the Home Office, the Christmas after I briefly in the autumn served as Home Secretary, so he sent me a Christmas card. Dear Grant, we thoroughly enjoyed having you here for a week's work experience. Please do come back again in the future. Anyway, so I've been in the Home Office, and I can tell you, I cannot see any sensible reason at all for not separating out people who come here to study, but not all these family visas and stuff. That I think we absolutely. I was preparing to clamp down on that in my 1 week. I'd said I would do that. But so let's not have all the families and everyone else. But we should have people come here to study because we want the income. It's an export when people come here to study, and B, for them to become Anglophiles. Yep. And like our friend there in the Gulf, really have a lifelong connection to the United Kingdom. That will benefit us in soft power around the world. So split that off from the figures. When we bring people in from Ukraine, because we're a big-hearted nation who feel this amazing affinity to Ukrainians or from Hong Kong, then split that off. Don't just say that it's part of it. We completely failed to do that and allowed it to be written as something that it wasn't quite true.
So how do we, looking forward, we've dealt with the election. Hopefully we never need to talk about that again. But we're in the midst of a leadership election now as well. And it's linked to the immigration point that it seems to me that one of the key policies and one of the key drivers of the leadership contest is immigration. You see people like Robert Jenrick being very clear on we need to leave the ECHR. He's consolidated in his mind that the only way of being able to pull the levers of power in any real way that aren't challenged and doesn't clog up the system is to leave the ECHR. And you've got other contenders, Priti Patel, for instance, who actually thinks the legislation we put in place allows us to do it without having to leave the ECHR. How do you think that's going to play out in the leadership? And, you've been as close to members, if not closer than I have, over the last 20 years. it seems to me that it is an important issue to members, but do you think it will define the leadership election, or will it be more than that?
I hope it's more than that, and I think it would be a big mistake if it is the lead issue. And I say that for this reason. I mean, first of all, I think it is massively important, as I say, not because I don't think the first job of the state is to secure its borders. I do. It may be true, and Jenrick might be right, that we have to leave the ECHR to do it. And by the way, I don't think it makes Jenrick some dangerous extremist or what have you to think that. I think, in reality, if not being in the ECHR enables us to perform the first duty of any government, protect your borders, then don't have the ECHR embedded in British law. I mean, we know that the way that this was done was fundamentally changed only as recently as the Blair government. So it's not the idea that there's some sacrosanct thing is complete nonsense. I suspect it takes somebody quite moderate in order to do it, in order not to kind of cause some.
No, we're even seeing. I mean, I don't know Tom Tugendhat particularly well. I've got to know him actually over the last couple of months, and his persona and the brand that I think Tom unfairly gets is much more to the left of the party than I think he actually is. Now, even Tom is talking about, if he has to, he'd leave the ECHR, but he thinks actually there are derogations that we could get.
Look, I don't know legally.
But it's interesting that most of them are moving towards this kind of more strong
But I also don't think it indicates that you're a lunatic if you believe it.
But it isn't. I mean, both are valid positions to make.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. No, totally. I just don't. No, there's a political issue. And the political issue is, to win again, we need to rebuild the coalition of people from a sufficiently wide spectrum of the public to support us in order for us to win, which includes the many Lib Dem seats we've lost.
Whereas the counterpart on Teesside is 67% of people in Redcar wanted to vote for Brexit. I think they would be quite comfortable tomorrow if we left
they won't mind. But here's the real secret to all of this that is missed by, I think, 90% of politicians and nearly 100% of the commentariat. People don't vote for policies in quite the way that people imagine. By which I mean, people will look at a politician or a political party and they go, you know what, I like them, I don't like them. They feel closer to their they feel maybe repelled by what they're saying. Yeah. What they then do, once they've got that in their minds, is backfit a policy reason to think in that way. I mean, this is what most normal people do. I say this because I think that the political classes think about it and politicians think about it entirely the other way around. If only I position myself exactly in this position on the ECHR or some other issue, I will be able to attract support from X or Y. Boris is quite interesting in this because actually probably believed something which was diametrically opposed to a lot of people, maybe in the rebel seats. I don't know, you tell me, but and popularised it. So if you take climate change, right, it wouldn't seem to be an obvious centre-right, crusade to be probably the only centre-right party in the world that was really progressive on climate change. We'll cut CO2 more than any other country in the world. This year we'll switch off coal as a form of making electricity. The first of any advanced country to do anything of the like. We've got more offshore wind farms than any country. The largest ones in the first, second, third, fourth, fifth largest in the world are all off our coast. All happened under Conservatives. And yet someone like Boris, because people would decide, I like that guy or I don't, the policy didn't necessarily matter. Well, I don't agree with him with that, but I still like the guy. Yeah. That was the thing. Too many politicians think that what you have to do is somehow craft the perfect policy platform. No. What you've got to do is show where your values are. You should show that you actually believe in the same things, because you actually do, that the country believes in. That is the fundamental, not the minutiae of, am I slightly to the left or right on this particular issue? And I just think, this is why I say on the ECHR, it just shouldn't be the defining issue.
It's also, I mean, my view of it as well, it's a slightly different one because I've never been of Westminster politics, but I often find that people are less interested in the means of a decision. Take me, for example, I mean, we nationalised the local airport, but we were also responsible for free ports, arguably the most free market policy that the Conservative government came up with over 14 years. Those two things, in policy terms, in that kind of Westminster bubble terms, people really struggle to understand how they fit together as part of my policy platform.
Yeah.
But the average person in the street doesn't care. They don't care whether it's nationalisation, free market politics. What they care about are the real deliverables on the ground, and the means with which you get there. The policy is much more secondary to the outcomes that are being delivered.
Absolutely. I think it's 100% right. And there's only a very, very, very narrow segment of people who really care whether you are, here, or here on the political spectrum, which is a pretty difficult thing to define. This sort of left and right.
Well, given that 99% of the public who aren't members of a political party, and most of the people don't particularly like politics in general, would never identify as left or right anyway. They just want their lives to feel...
It's an odd thing to even do. Yeah. I think we have the French Revolution to blame for the left and right and spectrum.
Yeah, the French are always to blame ultimately, aren't they?
There's a good principle. Yeah.
So if you take all of that and, given your experience in government and all of what we've talked about, what would your advice be? Not necessarily to any particular leadership contender, but what's your advice to the leadership contenders in what should a modern Conservative Party look like? And if you're knocking on somebody's door, what do you want people to respond when you ask them, what do you believe that the Conservative Party stands for?
So I think the first advice would be ourselves and be inclusive, not divisive. And so I think we've got some advantages, as I described already. We are where the country is if we are ourselves. Centre-right, that's where the country is. We don't need to move. We are, I think, a much more inclusive-looking party, just at the basic level. You think about the people who are running for leadership from much more varied backgrounds than would have been the case a decade or two ago. That's good. Didn't do us any particular political favours, but it won't have harmed us either. If you see what I mean.
True.
I think that's a good thing. And I think actually, being people really like authenticity in their leaders, and I think that really helps. And we saw, didn't agree with the word he said, but Corbyn was authentic. You just believe this batshit crazy stuff.
I think we saw the same thing with Boris. I mean, one of the things obviously people know that I was a supporter of Boris and still am really, and I think when he came up to places like Teesside, it really literally was like having a rock star.
Yeah.
People would mob him in the street. You didn't have to say Boris is coming.
Yeah.
After a few minutes of him just turning up somewhere, people would gravitate towards him. But what was always interesting, you get that, I thought, quite needly question from the media saying, well, how does somebody in Teesside identify with somebody like Boris Johnson? And my response to that was, well, because people in Teesside don't need their leader to be like them and look like them and talk like them.
Yeah.
What they like is the authenticity. And I think the one thing that Boris was, he was authentic. He was what he was, right?
Yeah.
And I think people can tell whether somebody's being false. They can tell the authenticity. And I think as a role of leadership, which hopefully our contenders take on, whoever becomes leader of the party, recognise that authenticity takes people much further, because people are much more savvy about their leaders and whether people are kind of putting on a front.
I think that's right. And I think
and
the only temper to that is, the only thing I temper about that is, it's important to, you don't have to say everything on your mind. Don't say, you don't have to go out your way to sort of to disagree with the public, but definitely being authentic, I think, is definitely helpful. I think Kemi is authentic, sometimes probably a bit too much, but nonetheless, I think she's says what she believes, for example.
And I think moving forward, one of the things that, particularly going back to your time as chairman of the party, one of the things that a lot of people, members that I speak to, people in associations, people associated with the Conservative Party, get pretty frustrated with our campaigning function, particularly CCHQ. And one of the reasons I'm asking you this as well is you've always, particularly within the parliamentary party, been someone very forward-thinking about how we engage with campaigning and where we need to campaign. I think I'm right in saying that you were the first, certainly Conservative MP on TikTok, and even now I suspect there's only a handful of people on TikTok. Again, what's that advice about how do we modernise the Conservative Party from a campaigning point of view? And what space should we be occupying under a new leadership?
According to the BBC, I was actually the very first MP to go on Twitter.
Entirely?
On Twitter,
All right.
not on TikTok.
Right,
So I joined in March 2008 and the BBC say that I never cross-sected, but say I was the first MP to join, because I thought, this is, really, really looks interesting. I think this could be pretty big, and obviously it's turned out to be enormous. And I went on TikTok, and I am on TikTok, because I believe that if that's where the public's going, no amount of sort of, the Chinese and what, yeah, fine, but don't install it on your phone. Don't be an idiot with your security. Of course, I've been Defence Secretary, of course. But this idea that you can somehow win elections by ignoring the platforms that your voters are on, literally refusing to meet your voters where they are, is insane. And I'm afraid that around the edges, some people have managed to convince the party we shouldn't be where the voters are. And so, for example, we didn't have a TikTok account set up for the Prime Minister until the election was called. And guess what? That's too late.
I remember you had your own TikTok account, and then there was this kind of guidance, I think, that went out to MPs about don't have TikTok, and I think you kept yours. But
the guidance was, I think, actually to ministers, and actually, in fairness, the guidance was don't have it on your phones. And when it went to MPs, the same thing. Don't put it on your phone. Don't use it on the estate. That's all obvious and fair enough.
Yeah.
And just to be clear, what I did was not have it on my phone. Yeah. Have a staff member, send your TikToks or whatever. Common sense stuff. It's the same with anything. Don't share your location. You don't have to switch those things on. But then to sort of take it to the point where you literally and deliberately remove yourself from being in front of voters, I mean, that's just insane.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid there are still one or two folks who seem to think that is the way forward for the party.
But I've always found it fascinating that there are still a lot of politicians of all different parties, actually, but in particular the Conservative Party, who don't seem to engage with social media full stop in the way that they could.
Yeah.
I mean, I still think Facebook in particular is much more of a powerhouse than people realise.
It's amazingly important because, not least, because you know where people live in a way that you don't with the other social media, which means that you can target people to the postcode. And that is massively important. None of these things on their own will, as I have evidence, none of these things on their own, when the political tsunami comes, they won't stop you from being wiped away. They'll probably mean that the swing against you wasn't quite as bad as elsewhere, and that was my situation, but they won't rescue on their own. That's why it's got to be a whole collective effort. Yep. That's why instructing our guys not to go on social media that the public is using is literally to admit failure, and your chances of winning are slim because you've I mean, the Labour Party must have been laughing. Yeah, the idea that we will just not communicate with voters and yet expect them to vote for us.
I tell you who were actually the best at it were Reform. Reform engaged with TikTok in particular and Instagram to some extent. Yeah. Their content, the way they communicated, the language they used to target people generally under the age of 30, arguably 25 in TikTok, was incredible compared to the political party. Yeah. So it's not just Labour,
just like all these social medias. It's like Facebook started off in universities around the time I became an MP, and that's why I went on it early in 2008. But now, who uses Facebook? Elderly. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's primarily a 60-plus platform. Social media platform. The same thing over a period of time will happen with other social media. I'm not saying TikTok tomorrow is going to be the pensioner's choice, but I do think we've got to understand that we need to be where the voters are, not pretending that somehow we're more righteous by not being on that social media platform.
And so, what's your view on the leadership contest at large? Do you think people are listening? Do you think people care? Do you think we've got the right candidates? How do you think it's?
I don't think the public is at all engaged, and I don't think it matters particularly.
Right, so you don't think that's necessarily a problem?
No,
that it's
I don't.
An internal process?
There's the election isn't for 5 years. Frankly, what happens this year and the rest of 2024 is not going to be particularly important to what happens in probably 2028 or 9 the next election. So I think the party's actually been right to take its time over it. I was an MP for the previous leadership election when we were in opposition, David Cameron, and that stretched out a long time, including through conference, and it actually did the party some good and gave us a chance to really think through. So no, I think that's actually the right move.
So you don't think it was a problem? Because again, there was a conversation, and my view, I think, I'm talking a matter of 2 or 3 weeks, but a slightly shorter campaign rather than a longer campaign, you don't really have an issue with the timescale?
It's like people who are probably Politico readers, like playbook readers like you and I, sort of, this is a major problem. And then you step back a bit and you realise it really wasn't the, if you live in that world, if you live in the playbook world, you literally end up thinking things like it will be impossible to ever complete Brexit. I can remember them writing it. This is virtually impossible. Well, guess what? These things do get something right. So the fact that, for example, Rachel Reeves has run a budget and an American president is nearly elected, actually won't be elected yet, but their vote will be very close to it. Really is not as catastrophic as some politicos seem to believe.
Right.
It really is not the end of the world, because the next election is nearly 5 years away. And the idea that we're going, why we lost the 2029 election, folks, it's because we did this thing 3 days later than we should have done. No.
And I don't disagree with that, but there is also a thing in politics of kind of momentum and tone. And I think one of the things that made me think that the leadership collection could be even slightly shorter is it just gives Labour more time after the election to define certainly the coming months and potentially the next year or two with their message rather than ours. I mean, one of the things we're seeing at the minute is they're trying to define all of the decisions they're about to make in the run-up to the budget and thereafter in light of trying to pin it on the Conservative Party. Yeah. Now, there are rights and wrongs of that. We don't need to get into that right now. But while they're doing that, we're talking to ourselves. And is there not something in us being able to form a proper opposition quickly to stop that?
No, look,
stop them being able to pin the blame on the Conservative Party?
I just think if the choice were between having a proper leadership election in which people have actually been able to see the candidates perform, even by now people will start be coming to some conclusions from what they've seen, but given longer and that gives us a better outcome. I think that's good. I think the public aren't stupid. I mean, the idea that they couldn't see the books. I mean, Rachel Reeves said herself that the thing about the OBR is you can see everything in advance, and that is literally true. So the idea that there was something that they didn't know about, the only thing that we didn't know about was they were going to cave into their union mates, pay them ludicrous levels of 22% for the junior doctors, 15% for ASLEF, but the day before ASLEF then announced a new set of strikes. You literally could not make up the income. If you are going to cave into your union mates, then it might be a good idea to check they're not about to call a new round of strikes before you do it. I mean, there's sheer incompetence. And the reasons like that have led to massive pressure on the finance, but the public aren't stupid enough to sort of think that they won't get away with it. And anyway, when those tax rises come, the public will remember that in the election they said there weren't any planned at all. Now, the difference is, I mean, I was in the government, in the coalition government, in the austerity government, where we did make these very, very difficult. I was a minister going through and having to go, there was a period for about 6 months. I didn't do anything as a minister other than have people in my office to tell them, unfortunately, we're having to, slash your budget in half or remove it entirely. That was my job entirely in 2010 as a housing minister, planning, local government minister. The difference here is they don't have the moral permission to do that, because we campaigned on a manifesto saying that we would have to impose that kind of austerity. Labour lied to the public and said there would be no cuts. And when they bring them in, it doesn't matter whether we're there as an opposition with a new leader or just having to wing it, because that's what we'll have to do if there's not a new leader in place. But it'll still be Jeremy Hunt will still answer them. That we've still got people there. The public aren't that stupid, and they are going to see right through it.
Do you think we also missed a trick during the campaign, though? Because one of the things that massively frustrated me was, particularly post-COVID, more than £500 billion spent supporting people.
Yes.
What we didn't do, which is what we did back in 2008, 2009 in the run-up to the election, is
remind
some
them.
Real home truths about what we've just had to do.
Yes.
And therefore, these are the decisions we have to take. We almost kind of put COVID in a box and pretended it didn't happen. And then when the consequences of COVID came,
we never said it.
We got blamed for it because we didn't set out that context.
You're absolutely right. And you know what's even more amazing, remarkable, is that the person who saved 9 million jobs and 5.5 million businesses with furlough and all the other support actually rarely mentioned it. And I think that Rishi could really have fought that election on the basis of...
Was that a conscious effort for him to do?
No, I don't think so. I think it's probably more just... I don't know, but I think it's just that sort of... just having that sixth sense about, taking people through the logical story. I think the logical story should have been Labour left the note saying there's no money left after the financial crash. We come in and we rescue the economy through very difficult measures, difficult decisions of austerity. Because of that, we had the money available to help with furlough and supporting people through COVID, and we wouldn't have done if we hadn't have dealt with some of those problems earlier on. But that hasn't meant that it's cost-free. And as you say, if you take the costs of COVID, a war in Europe, that's £500 billion of direct costs to the economy. And look, folks, we're going to have to, things are going to be tougher as a result. That is a pretty logical story, but instead we've neglected to mention those things.
So do you think, just wrapping this bit up, do you think that the Labour Party will be successful in blaming us for the decisions they're about to make in the budget and over the coming months?
No, I don't. And I think that they're being too clever by half by trying it as well, because I think, there is nothing that they couldn't see now that they're in power that wasn't already available. That is what the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility literally means, that the figures are all available. And the bits they couldn't see were the bits that they have themselves done, like those massive pay rises, which in themselves will be inflationary, which in itself will have a cost attached. No, they couldn't. That wasn't there because we weren't about to do 22% or 15% or whatever. So those are the bits that weren't apparent. But literally everything else was there. And the consequence of what they're doing now goes beyond just does the public notice or the opinion polls. I'm really seriously worried in areas like defence, where not committing to 2.5%, which was my greatest, if you ask me what my greatest achievement was, it was getting a timescale attached to 2.5% so that we could defend this country properly and do good in the world. And Labour's failure to commit to that 2.5% hasn't been covered all that much in the media, but literally means that savage cuts are underway now in our armed forces that could cost this country dearly and make the world a less safe place.
Well, I wanted to come on to that just to kind of, as we come towards the end, I know that your time in as Defence Secretary was something extremely important to you and you found really rewarding. It's something that you still get involved with to this day. I mean, what are the potential consequences to a non-commitment from the UK government to that 2.5%?
So these consequences are immediate. They're flowing now. It means in-year budget cuts, which are savage. But more than that, it means you can't commit to the big programmes. So we have a big programme, for example, to work with America and Australia on something called AUKUS, which is to help provide Australia with nuclear-powered submarines. Why does it matter? Because the real geopolitical contest, if you like, through countries which have a very different view of the way that we should organise ourselves. They don't believe in democracies. China believes in a communist party whose entire purpose is to keep the Communist Party in power. Russia is an autocracy with a despotic leader who it has invaded its neighbour. Are we happy that the world moves in that direction and that they interfere in Western elections or what have you? One of the things I feel more passionate about after the election even than before is, I have willingly, at the behest of voters, surrendered power, including being in one of the most powerful jobs in the country as Defence Secretary and my constituency seat, because democracy demanded it. That's it. And that is what we should all be fighting for. We should be fighting for the right to lose, right? But people like Putin and systems like the Chinese system do not believe in those things. So AUKUS matters, not because Australia will get a few nuclear-powered submarines, but because the balance of global power and the way that we live our lives in the future is at risk. And if you don't commit now to 2.5%, then what happens is you don't have the money to commit to that program. You don't have the money to commit to 6th generation fighter jets. That's a program called GCAP, which is us working with the Italians and
Could you explain
Japanese.
I think for lots of people listening, I mean, it's not my area of expertise either, but for listeners of the Blueprint podcast, could you explain in practical terms what these budget cuts mean to our armed forces?
Yeah. So the armed forces need equipment and kit in order to operate, in this country and around the world. These budget cuts mean that equipment won't be forthcoming. and more people are likely to leave our armed forces, which will create a deeper recruitment crisis, which means we won't be properly protected. Worse than that, though, it sends a terrible message to our allies.
I was going to ask you about
because it sort of, they look to us to lead on a lot of this stuff, and us doing it means that they get off their backsides and do it as well. And it sends a terrible message to our adversaries because they go, NATO's weak. If the Brits aren't doing it and we're normally the leading force, no one else is going to follow. So we give up our leadership in the world by failing to do these things. And I think that's a serious problem.
Well, I think we've got two sides of that coin as well, in that you've got the American elections coming up, which could see a really different approach to NATO depending on who gets in, whether that's Trump or Harris. And we know what Trump's historical behaviour has been like about trying to force partners of NATO to spend its minimum commitment. But on the other side of the coin, you've already got those in the Eastern Bloc. You've got Poland, for instance, who've just announced an increase of their GDP defence spend to 4.7%. So there is an issue here. That what kind of signal does it send to those who are at the forefront of the potential threat from the East?
Yeah, but it's terrible.
What do our Polish colleagues think of that?
I can tell you what they think, but I can't tell you what they think. I know what they think.
I could probably guess.
Yeah, you can guess. Look, they're spending 4% or probably going higher, and we are at 2.2% and probably going lower if they don't get their fingers out. And I think that is really problematic because we have to be. We are the world's oldest democracy in terms of sort of ongoing, and this Conservative Party, by the way, is the oldest political party, democratic political party in the world. And there is a responsibility, I think, in this country to lead the world, and people look to us for these things. And I think it's incredibly short-sighted not to do that. It will in other words, it's much cheaper to prevent war than it is to not prepare and then have to fight it. And that is a simple equation like that.
Well, what do you think the consequences of the upcoming cuts to our defence budget mean for the Ukrainian conflict?
Well, President Zelensky has said it in his own words, and I have not much to add to it, which is that he has noticed I think he framed it as noticing a sort of bleeding off or a pullback in British forward-leaningness. So we've had the traditional position because of Ben Wallace, my predecessor, myself as Defence Secretary, of being the most forward-leaning nation when it came to understanding that this is an existential threat to all of our ways of life, and it would be cheaper to stop him at the pass, Putin that is, than to let him carry on. And I hope that this is just the early growing pains of a new government, trying to work out what it should do on these matters. But I'm very concerned, and so are a lot of our Ukrainian friends. I keep in very close contact with them.
And what do you think the consequences of the American election are going to be on Ukraine?
It's so hard to say.
Difficult,
it's very, very hard to say. As you say, the thing about Trump is he's unpredictable. He makes a brand out of being unpredictable. That's his
how he negotiates.
MO, isn't it? Yeah. So impossible to say. All the more reason why Britain, as the leading military force in Europe and the second biggest spender in NATO, it's the reason why we should be taking that lead. And I regret that we look that our allies, that Zelensky has said that he thinks our support might be wavering, is I think should be the front page splash every day until that changes. And it surprises me it's not.
Well, the reason I asked the question about America is that do you think in your time as Defence Secretary and in government generally, if the UK takes a strong lead, like we did in the Ukraine, to be fair, I mean, under Boris and the government at the time, we were the leaders in being able to form that coalition to support the Ukraine. Do you find that with a strong Britain, if it had a strong defence and a strong voice, the Americans are influenced by that?
Massively.
Or do you think the American
massively.
politics will just not listen to what's happening elsewhere?
I can absolutely, in ways that I can't be public about, but I can absolutely assure people listening that when we act, the Americans listen, and in the case of Ukraine, frequently followed us. So we've always been in a leadership role, and they have it's helped move policy in Capitol Hill, in the White House. A way I can explain, actually. I went to Capitol Hill and I asked them to extend permissions for weapons called ATACMS to be used in Crimea, which are US missiles. And after some lobbying there, the chairs of the various different foreign and defence committees in both houses wrote to Biden directly following my representation, and Biden provided permissions and action was taken. So, I couldn't have gone and made that moral case if we weren't prepared to do the same thing. So, yeah, it matters.
Well, that's really interesting. And it's something to be fair, we could revisit again in the future, depending on how things develop. But unfortunately, we're always time limited. Just to wrap up, a couple of things from you, Grant, as we move away from all of the substantive stuff. What's next for Grant? Now you're no longer an MP. It sounds like it's treating you well. You seem you seem like you're well. You've had a holiday. If you haven't had a holiday, you're looking like you've got a tan. what does the future hold for Grant? Will you be back in politics?
We had a holiday and we're going to go away again. I'm enjoying just being if you like, a sort of a free citizen, and I don't have as a group of people following me around as you do when you're in an area like defence, where you have a protection team 24 hours. So that happens, if you're having dinner, on a Saturday night with your partner, my wife, you'd be there with usually 5 blokes and 3 armoured vehicles, and so all of that stuff goes. So I'm really enjoying that. I'm enjoying doing some things in the commercial world. I've always been very entrepreneurial. I have a couple of startups that I'm one in AI, which I'm getting underway. So I be keeping myself incredibly busy, but my time's not quite done in politics yet. I really love this country and the way that you can serve it through public life. And a lot of people think it's crazy, and why would you want to do that, and why would you want to have all the abuse and all the rest of it that goes with it. But actually, it really matters. We were just having a conversation there about Ukraine and defence. It really, really matters, and this country matters, and we can be better than the sum of our parts. And I still want to make sure that I have given everything to make sure that this country is better than the sum of its parts for everybody who's British. So yeah, I'm not quite done.
Oh, well, I'm glad to hear that.
The itch is still there.
No, absolutely. And I think it would be a shame if you'd have come on and said that this was the end of your political journey. So I look forward to seeing what that holds in the future. And well, it'll be good to have you back on. I really appreciate your time, Grant.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Blueprint Podcast, brought to you by Conservative Home with me, Ben Houchen. Remember, you can like and subscribe on all of our social media channels, and you can catch a new episode every single Wednesday, wherever you get your usual podcasts from.